Well, hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to the Reforming Nerdom podcast. I am your host for this episode, Jordan Cecile, and I am hosting solo, but not totally solo. Nate and Ben, they're busy guys being all pastoral, and they're planning for our conference that our church is having this week. But I am joined by a very special guest. He is the host of the CivEccly Minded podcast and a self-proclaimed Daredevil expert. If you could see from the title of the episode, we're going to be talking all things Daredevil today. I want to welcome Mr. Cory Wing. Cory, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you for the invite. I'm thrilled to be here. Just the whole concept of what you guys do is it's like my buddy Keith came on, before me and talked Superman, which is his expertise. And
Yep.
when we both heard about this idea, we were like, what? This is a thing. It was just because for nerds, man, this is we've waited for an era where comic book movies and TV would be made and they wouldn't be just terribly embarrassing. And then of course Marvel has degenerated back into making
yeah.
really bad stuff. But there for a while they got it really good.
Yeah, I know. And you know what? As we have people on and talk about the show with people, we're just having a blast doing it. And as nerds, to be able to just talk about nerds and not feel ashamed of doing it. And because that's just like a thing that we hear so much with people is, I'm gonna just like keep this to myself. I'm not really gonna say much because like, are people gonna look down on me and my, especially in like the church community and, oh, my small group, am I really gonna tell people that I just spent the whole weekend binge watching a TV show or catching up on Marvel movies or building Lego, whatever it is? And we just hear that across the board. And so I think it's like it's good for, it's like therapeutic for us to be like, no, this is actually okay. It's good. And then for other people to see that it's good and okay as well is really what we want to do. We want to help people realize that, no, this is actually a good thing. God made it. It's in, all of this is in his creation. So let's enjoy it to the glory of God. And as the name of the show indicates, we need to reform it. It absolutely needs reforming, just like everything else does. But if you don't even have that theological mindset, though, you're not going to think it's a project worth actually pursuing if you don't think things are going to be reformed. So, that's our theology kind of bleeds out in this whole thing, and this whole project exists it only makes sense in a worldview that sees some progressive victory of the church in the culture.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think one of the things that so many people who didn't grow up kind of in geek culture, nerd culture, they didn't understand because I'm going to be 47 next month. So I was born in 1978. Of course, the biggest thing in nerddom in the zeitgeist when I was a boy, just born, was there was this small movie that had come out the year before I was born in 77. It's the name is eluding. It's Star Wars. That's right. So Star Wars had come out the year before I was born, so I literally grew up with Star Wars. So like the first tattoo I ever got is on my chest, and it's the sign. It's the symbol for the Jedi Order.
Mm.
So and I got that at like 20, 21.
Yep.
So it was. That's been such a part of who I have been my whole life. But I say that to say, those who haven't been into any of that stuff don't really understand that comic books and sci-fi and a lot of this stuff is kind of the mythology of our time.
Yeah.
That the men that wrote these stories and that did the artwork and kind of captured a whole generation of boys, they understood that there were beautiful archetypal, personas, all the way back to the Iliad, the Odyssey, even scripture, of course, obviously scripture, it would be the primary one. And so when you see the hero's journey, in say Star Wars, and you see Luke will never be who Luke needs to be as long as Obi-Wan's there for him to fall back on. But then you start to see, wow, that story is repeated all the time in history.
Uh-huh.
That is such a familiar archetype that that there's a reason it connects with us. And I've seen the bigger picture of what some of these stories are and what they can be. and now with a son of my own, and I've got 2 daughters and a son, and my daughters like some of the stuff, but my son is getting ready to turn 6, so he is all in.
Mhm.
You know, I mean,
Yeah.
this is like he wants to watch Lord of the Rings, and he wants to watch Harry Potter, and he wants to watch, last night he wanted to watch Black Panther, the first Black Panther movie, because I told him the second Black Panther movie is terrible, we're not gonna watch it.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, but so yeah, it's fun to now be able to relive some of this stuff with my own son and get to see a whole new generation kind of going, "Awesome, we can be nerds, and it can be okay, and still be Christians."
Well, it's been I mean, we talk about this all the time, bringing up our kids, and I think Ben, Nate, and myself, all of our kids kinda like different things, and I even just see with my own kids how the joy they have in being able to experience this stuff with dad and just seeing that, oh, dad likes this thing that I also like. And then so they're just thrilled when we're sitting down and whether it's watching a movie or playing a video game and they just look over and I'm sitting there playing with them and they're smiling. It's just like, it's such a great thing to do together with
Yeah.
them. And it's such an easy, and so because it's interesting, I just saw this. It was a statistic that was saying like, our generation, I mean, I'm 10 years younger than you or less than 10, but, like, our generation it spends, like, 3 times more with our kids than the previous boomer generation. And so, it's interesting how that older generation would look at, I think, guys like you and I who spend time, yeah, our free time enjoying these, mo means of entertainment and be like, "Oh, what a waste of time," but then it's like, "Okay, but you're missing that a lot of this time is actually being spent with our kids as well." And so, yes, we might be doing these things that you perceive as being immature, but I actually am spending way more time with my kids than my dad or his dad would have spent with them. So it's actually a great way to just kind of, again, not that we want to prolong adolescence, but it is actually a way of engaging with our kids where they're at and what they like. And that's one of the things I love about being able to do this stuff is that I am passing it on to my kids and I see that they're experiencing the same joy of it as I am.
That's exactly right, and isn't that again, I'm a Presbyterian guy, so we are big into, of course, covenantal children. We
Mhm.
baptize our kids, and that's a big part of being Presbyterian. But the idea behind that, the doctrinal idea behind that, of course, beyond we believe it's biblical, there is a more theological or doctrinal position as well that we would say we are doing that, ancient Deuteronomy 6, kind of raise your children in something,
Mhm.
bring them up from the youngest of ages to where they understand and know these things are important to mom and dad, and yeah, while it's silly that it might be, again, Harry Potter or Daredevil, um, it's not really Harry Potter and Daredevil. It's the greater stories that are being told through those stories, and so, yeah, that's why I'm excited about being here today and being able to unpack I think one of the most complex and, exciting and religiously thrilling characters in all of comics.
In preparation for this, because part of what we're gonna talk about is the new show that's coming out. Disney is bringing back Daredevil, for those who don't know. I think it's, the March 4th is when it's coming out, and it was, one of those shows that was just beloved when it was on, and so then in preparation for this, like, my exposure with Daredevil definitely was the Netflix show. I mean, the Ben Affleck movie, but I think most people would say that that's not Marvel at its best. Um, so I watched through over the last couple weeks, all 3, of the seasons on Netflix, and I was blown away. Again, I watched the first 2 seasons a while back, never watched the 3rd season, and how complex this world is of the battle or, like, the try to figure out, like, what is the moral right thing to do in this situation? Like, what is the just thing to do? Because obviously this whole I mean, you can't talk about Wilson Fisk without wanting justice, right? In the things that in how he's living and how he's dictating things in Hell's Kitchen, and so it is just like there are layers to this show, I think, and I'm sure we'll get into that and just the character because I'd be curious, Stephen, just for you being more of a fan generally of Daredevil, how the show was faithful or whether there were aspects of the show that you thought could have been better. But yeah, like this is I think Daredevil is one of the most fascinating Marvel characters because like he absolutely is a well, I would devout, but he is at least a professing Catholic, and that
Yeah.
keeps coming up on his struggle with whether he's willing to kill somebody or what he's willing to do or not do. So I just yeah, so I'm excited to get into Daredevil kind of as a whole, the character, but then also your thoughts on the show and whether you think it can be good or salvaged, because that's just a conversation that we keep having is, well, what are our hopes and expectations for Marvel now moving forward? So, but before we talk about Daredevil, one of the things we like to do is just get a sense for our guests when we have them on, just to give an idea to our listeners and viewers, what kind of a nerd are you? So I'm just going to ask you rapid fire a few questions here just to give us an idea of what kind of nerd is Cory Wing. Ready for
Okay.
that?
Yeah, yeah.
All right, perfect. All right, so first off, Star Wars or Star Trek?
I like both, but Star Wars definitely above Star Trek, though both franchises have been really doing themselves damage in recent years.
Okay, I would agree. Lord of the Rings or Narnia?
Again, fan of both, but I would go both book on film, Lord of the Rings.
Okay. Marvel or DC?
Oh, it's not that simple for me. Um, it
Okay,
because
gun to your head. A metaphorical gun to your head. You had to
uh,
choose.
uh, probably DC, and
Okay.
because I think they have better overarching, again, moral characters.
Mhm.
There are characters in Marvel like Daredevil, the Hulk's another one. I've been a huge Hulk fan since I was a kid. Um, of course, every kid goes through Spider-Man, and I still like Spider-Man. My younger son, my son is all Spider-Man. Like, he wants to be Peter Parker. Um, so I mean, I'm reliving Spider-Man again right now. But but if I had to choose, I'd say DC. I even though they've done poorly at the box office and Marvel kicked their tail with the MCU over the DCEU. Um, I think DC's characters are just they're you talk about part of the zeitgeist. I mean, who in the
Mhm.
world, even if you're not into comics, who doesn't know Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman and I mean they are the Joker. I mean, the Joker's the worst, but yeah, I mean, he is every my wife, who was raised in a family of all girls, doesn't know anything about any of this until she married me. She knew who the Joker was. She knew who Batman was. I mean, DC has captured um the 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 imagination of 4 or 5 generations of
Mhm.
Americans, and it's been pretty impressive to see that.
Yeah, because Marvel's, uh, I guess, taking the throne has really only been in the last, like, 10 or so years. Because we when you look at all the DC movies or all the like, the Batman movies of the '90s, so much of the TV shows, the animated shows were, the Batman. So I'm more of a DC guy, but, I'm also DC in some things, Marvel in other things, but we can maybe talk about that because
Exactly.
it's there are certain areas where I think both, shine better. All right, next up, favorite video game console?
Hmm. I would probably have to say, like, the Xbox One,
Oh, wow. Okay.
because yeah, yeah.
Okay. Favorite cartoon growing up?
I was a big again, different eras of childhood. So, young kid, G.I. Joe, no
Yeah.
question.
Okay.
G.I. Joe was everything. As I got older, X-Men, the OG X-Men series that they just did the kinda reboot of on Disney Plus.
Was that
Yeah.
good? Was that good? Did you watch it?
The reboot? Yeah, the reboot was,
Is
I mean, there was some woke stuff in it because, well, it's modern Disney,
Yeah,
but all in all, the artwork was faithful, they used the theme song. I mean, there was a ton of nostalgia.
cool,
um, they leaned into that original series, and I credit them for that.
cool. They, another great example, and I've mentioned this a bunch because I still play with my kids, is the, Ninja Turtles: Shredder's Revenge. And they did the same thing. It was like the intro music, the actual pixelated art, so much of it was just faithful, and it just felt like you were playing the next actual game that just would have come out 20 years ago, and it
Yeah.
was so good. So, the X-Men is one that I need to get. We're catching up on all of our Marvel stuff, and as even I found as in watching in preparation for the Daredevil show, there's gaps now as I watched the trailer and I realized, "Oh, wait, how did that happen? That wasn't even addressed in the Daredevil show. Oh, it's because it was in this other thing, and there's, like, all these other, side places where characters showed up, and, okay. Favorite action hero?
Now you're talking not just animated. This would be live action?
Live action superhero,
Okay,
yeah,
live
yeah.
action. Uh, as a boy, I would have said someone different, but now as a man, I would have to say Neo.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, are you a big, Matrix fan then?
Yeah, I mean, I even saw the 4th one that was made, many years later that's fairly recent, and there were holes, there were flaws there. I mean, it you can't, and that's the problem with rebooting any of this stuff is you can never really recapture lightning in a bottle, right?
No, it was a moment, yeah,
Yeah, so I mean, but I was in college when the first one came out, and I remember going to the theater and seeing that original Matrix, and it was the closest thing to seeing Star Wars for the first time
yeah,
that I could
mm,
relate anything to, and when that bullet time sequence where
mhm,
she goes up and freezes and she does that kick, and I mean, that first scene with Trinity, I was I was in,
yeah.
if I wasn't in before that, moment of bullet time, I was like, "Oh."
Well, is there any more iconic a choreographed scene than him when he's going backwards with the bullet shooting at him? Like, that is one of the most iconic action scenes of all time.
Well, and because it's been spoofed on,
That's
like,
it.
animation and all kind I mean,
Yeah,
so that you've done something pretty amazing when it lives on in, Family Guy or, some other medium, Rick and Morty or I mean, when someone else does the homage, then you really have done something special.
yep, that's right. Okay, last thing, favorite nerd activity?
It'd be between reading and video games, which is bizarre because I know those 2 things are very different.
Mm.
But yeah, it'd be between reading and video games.
Those are my 2 things as well, and then my challenge is often I'm reading good books and then, oh, but I still wanna play a game because I don't wanna just not play, but
Yeah.
then I am comp or sacrificing one for the other, and it's just always you can't sit there and play a video game while you're reading a book at the same I mean, you could audiobook it, but I find it's hard to really track with an audiobook if you're gaming, and, so what are you playing right now? Like, if you were to play a video game right now, what would it be?
This is gonna make me sound old, but I am old. Now most of my gaming is done on, like, an iPad I mean, because the more intricate games that are console related, again, like PlayStation, Xbox stuff, I just with being a father of 3 small kids, and I'm on full-time pastoral staff at my church, and I still go to seminary, and I run a podcast, and, so with all the things in my life, putting 30 hours into, the Force Awakens, word of which I know is not the name, but, the newest Star Wars game or the newest God of War, or I just don't have that kind of time anymore, so, sadly, now it's the cheap little video games that you download on your iPhone or your iPad, and, it's just I mean, sometimes it's as simple as, like, the color by number, the
Yeah,
paint
yeah.
by I mean, I just something to take my mind off of everything, and just zone out.
Well, it's kinda interesting, like, that's a topic that we wanna bring up at some point because in our Discord, somebody was kind of posing the question, like, "What is a gamer?"
Yeah.
So, well, what constitutes a gamer? Is somebody who plays, uh, what's the not my I'm thinking of the Jewel game that people play on their phone,
Oh, Bejeweled
Crazy
yeah,
Crush? Or no, what is it?
yeah,
Candy
Candy
Crush, Candy
Crush,
Crush, that's
Bejeweled,
it.
all that stuff, yeah.
And it's just, well, they're playing a game. It's not on a console. It's not with a controller. It's not with a mouse and keyboard, but it's a game. Somebody plays crossword puzzles on their phone or chess on their phone. They're like, so I would say why not? It's just whatever your flavor is. There's some people who like sports games, first person shooter games, role playing games. It's so no, I totally get it because that's the only reason right now why I play a little bit more than I have over the last few years is I figured out how to stream from my consoles to like I have a Steam Deck, which is just a portable gaming
Yeah.
PC, and so I can play that in bed. So sometimes at night, if I before I start reading, if my wife is just, listening to her book or something, I'll play for 15, 20 minutes. I don't have to be in my office where, I have all my console stuff in here. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it because we like to go to bed at the same time. Typically at night, like we're hanging out, we're doing something. So it's just that's a way for me to still be able to play. If I didn't have that, I probably wouldn't play video games almost at all, other than I've actually looked at it, and it started with COVID, was just staying connected with some buddies who don't live near me anymore, and so now it's an opportunity. I got a friend who moved out west. I can now play, Fortnite with him. We just hop on and do that. And now actually with our Discord, which is kind of fun. I mean, we've got people in our Discord server who aren't anywhere near us, so we're trying to build out that community. And we have some guys who are local, so we can go to movies together and hang out. We can do meetups, go have dinner or something like that. But not everybody can do that, so we want to try to foster that community. And one of the ways we can do that easily is just gaming and
Yeah.
just hop on and play, and we get to meet people. So I think it's yeah, you do it. I mean, whatever your phase of life is, and you just kind of adapt to that. I think.
Now, I would say that probably gaming, there was no game um, again, 2 eras of gaming, because again, at my age, there's been multiple iterations of technology. So, I am of that kinda terminal generation that was arcade goers, right?
Mm.
My older brother's turning 50 this year, so we were both huge arcade kids, so early arcade stuff, all the Centipede, Galaga, all that stuff, pinball, all the way up to really, when it hit sweet spot for us was probably when we were in high school, which would have been like um, Street Fighter 2, Mortal
Mhm.
Kombat 1 and 2, Tekken, even Tekken Tag, so that era of, like, arcading was primo, and then I really hit that early World of Warcraft, as well. So when that first, MMORPG stuff started hitting, I was in my mid-20s, maybe, getting toward my late 20s, and it was just again, I had a little more expendable income, so I could afford to do something like that, and, yeah, man, World of Warcraft was, like, life-changing. I mean, because again, like what you were saying, though, I made friends, I mean, I started having real friends that lived, 7, 8, 9 states away from me, and, I mean, we had meetups, and, I mean, it fostered real relationship, as bizarre as that may seem to people that aren't into it.
No, it's totally true. It's an interesting conversation to have over that because I think that older generation, they just don't understand that. They can't fathom what that is like, but it's just such an easy way to maintain relationships and okay. Well, hey, that's cool. You and I are very similar in a lot of these things. Many of these things I would share your thoughts on. So why don't we now or why don't we just hop into our topic of the show? We want to talk about Daredevil. The new show is coming out. You are probably from what I can gather, the most nerd or Daredevil expert amongst Reformed Christians. Keith Foskey was his self-proclaimed expert on Superman, and it sounds like you're quite passionate and have a history of Daredevil. So before we, talk about the new movie, why don't I just give a little bit of a background of this character for those who might not know of Daredevil? Just a little bit of a synopsis on kind of who he is, some of the facts around the character, and then you can go off and tell us why you love this character as much as you do. That work?
Yeah, yeah.
All right, perfect. So, Daredevil, he is a real name, Matthew Murdock. He had his first appearance in in Marvel Comics in Daredevil number 1 in 1964, created by Stan Lee and Bill Everett. The character is known for being blind as a child, but then uh, blinded by radioactive chemicals while he was saving somebody from an oncoming truck. This accident heightened his remaining senses, so now he almost has superhuman hearing and his ability to sense and feel things. So yes, he can't see, but he kind of can see, and actually, at least in the show, they make it seem like he can maybe see better than us in some ways, those who have eyesight, because of how enhanced his senses are. But he's trained in martial artists or martial arts, so he is a lawyer by day. He is then a vigilante crime fighter by night. And some of his allies in the show are his best friend and law partner, Foggy Nelson, Karen Page, a secretary and love interest, Elektra, which is a sometimes ally, sometimes villain, depending on where it is in the story. And then most notably, I think for Daredevil is his main villain, which is Wilson Fisk and the Kingpin, which I have much to say about Kingpin and Wilson Fisk. But then also this character has had different adaptations. His first major role was in the Daredevil movie, which was with Ben Affleck. That was in 2003. most notably the Daredevil TV show on Netflix, which ran from 2015 to 2018. And then subsequently, he's been in a few other MCU projects just in cameo roles. And just what I was really surprised to see, the critical response to the original show on Netflix. 99% critic review positive 99% review by critics and 92% by audiences on, Rotten Tomatoes for the first season, 81 and 87 on season 2, and then the 3rd season was 98 and 96. So this was a very well-received, TV show from Netflix. It won awards, Primetime Emmy Awards. It has continued to have, huge popularity and viewership. It was canceled to much dismay by many fans. I'm sure yourself, Corey, was quite surprised given how good, the show really was. But now fans rejoice because it has now been resurrected, born again, if you will, and it is now coming to, Disney Plus. And most importantly, they are continuing. This is not a fresh start. Like, this is a direct continuation of the Netflix show. So, Mr. Cory Wing, why do you or I guess to first off, tell us a little bit about your history with this character and what made you kind of fall in love with Daredevil?
Sure, sure. I was a total comic book nerd as a kid. I had entire drawers of my, chest of drawers and dresser in my bedroom that didn't have clothes in them. They had comics or comic book cards because Marvel made some comic book card series when I was a boy. And then I would draw, all kids do. And I would have pictures of characters that I drew. And again, because I grew up in a Christian family, Daredevil, um, because of his religious overtones, just fascinated me because that was not normal in comic books. I mean, comics was a pretty secular space even back then. And so there were kind of 2 major characters in Marvel that kind of leaned in on Christianity, one of them being Daredevil and the other one being Nightcrawler.
Mm. You
And
think?
so I was a big Daredevil fan. My younger brother was and is still a
Mm.
Nightcrawler super fan. You go into his house to this day, he's married, got, a child of his own, and there is Nightcrawler stuff everywhere. I mean, he married a woman that is an artist by trade. So, I mean, she's done pieces of artwork that are Nightcrawler. I mean, so yeah, we both kinda leaned into those Christian, characters. But more than that, you got into Daredevil's, origin story and kinda how far back he goes. The That's kind of what I was getting at very early on when we started, the episode, was talking about how comics are great about kind of being in the cultural zeitgeist and kind of following along with what is going on in the world. So, as you just said, Daredevil #1 was released in, 1964. Technically, it was April of 1964. Um, but again, if you understand where the world was, where the United States was, it makes a little more sense. So April 1964, let's do just a brief history lesson. Um, our 35th president had just been elected in November, of course, of 1960, and it was a young Irish Catholic man named John F. Kennedy. And, of course, sadly, he was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. But the idea of this young Irish Catholic hero who was a lawyer, which,
Mm.
John Kennedy was not, but his brother Robert Kennedy was. So the Kennedy family was very prominent and still, I mean, like our new Secretary of Health and Human Services is a Kennedy, so the Kennedys are still a big deal here in America. But they were, I mean, everywhere, everything in the early '60s. So into the early '60s come, Stan Lee, and yes, it absolutely was, Bill Everett was the artist, but, the concept design artwork was actually done by Jack Kirby. So it was Kirby and Lee, who came up with the idea of Daredevil, and then Bill Everett did the early artwork. Um, but when you see the early Kennedys, and John F. Kennedy is this young Irish Catholic guy who's a brawler, and his brother Robert's a lawyer, and they would take on these street level criminal thug organizations like the Teamsters Union
Uh,
and Jimmy Hoffa. So you start to even look at the world of Daredevil, and you start to look at the 1960s of America, and you kinda go, "This is starting to make more sense." You know, because the other characters that were introduced in the early '60s, man, for those of you that are watching and don't know, the early '60s was Marvel's gold. I mean, it now they don't call it the golden era, but or maybe they do. Maybe the silver era was earlier and it's the golden era at this time. And I should remember that, but I don't. But the other characters that came out from 1960 to 63, right before Daredevil, would be Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, the Fantastic Four, Thor, and Iron Man. So, I mean, those are all names we all know, right? I mean, those are
Yep.
huge characters. And but they're all big characters with huge, you know, super powered villains too, right? So the Fantastic Four fights these world-ending, Galactus and all I mean, huge enemies. The Incredible Hulk is the strongest there is, for goodness sakes. Spider-Man, yes, he's a kid, but as he comes into his own and he starts to realize just how truly strong he is, his foes become stronger and more capable. And of course, Iron Man and Thor, my goodness, he's a god. So you start to contrast all of those very huge characters with very big worlds and big enemies with this street level hero called Daredevil, who instead of taking on galactic threats is taking on street level corruption. I mean, and it was just it was so different. It was so very different to all of the other grandiose stories that were being told in the early '60s by Stanley and Jack Kirby. And so that just fascinated me as well. And I kind of, I got the bug and that was it. And I started reading, of course, the origin story is there in issue one, obviously, and that introduces everything you said. That he's in an accident, he gets disabled, he then is trained by this guy named Stick, who helps train him into how to use his blindness as an advantage instead of a disadvantage. His dad had been a kind of amateur boxer, and had been killed by, again, the mob, and so he has this legitimate beef against kind of low level crime, and now he's trying to figure out his way in the world, right?
Mhm.
And so you fast forward to I'm born in '78. In 1986, a guy named Frank Miller would take over the series, and and an artist named David Mazzucchelli would do the artwork, and it would become some of the most seminal time in the Daredevil franchise. And excuse me just a second. They would do this. They would write and art Born Again. So
Mm.
so this is Daredevil Born Again, the what's called trade paperback. Now that is not the original copy I had when I was a kid because it would have been dog-eared, and I mean, now I've had this one for years, but I've had it as an adult where I take better care of things. But, uh but yeah, it was, so Born Again would be written, and it would explore so much very kinda dark content. In the comic version of Born Again, um, Matt's life is kinda systematically destroyed by Kingpin, and again, I don't know if that's where they're gonna head in the new series because they've somewhat put some of the themes of Born Again into season 3 already.
Mhm. Yeah.
So some of Born Again, the comic, was already explored in Daredevil season 3 on Netflix, and, and so it's very hard for me to understand how they're gonna kinda wrap this title in with whatever it is they're gonna do now in what really is season 4, even though it's the 1st season on Disney Plus. It's like you said, they're doing a continuation, so it's really season 4 of the show. And, so I'm very intrigued to see where they're gonna take this storyline because they've taken some of the biggest storylines of Daredevil comics, because he's such an old character. There have been some massive, overarching storylines in that amount of time. I mean, season 2 of the show explored kind of Elektra, and that saga was in the early '80s, but again, that was Frank Miller as well. So Frank Miller and it was a different artist, I can't remember which artist worked on that one, but, Electra, Natchios is her last name, and she's Greek, and they fall in love, and they're both very broken, right? I mean, so that's kind of
Mhm.
the thing about both characters is they're emotionally, spiritually, even physically scarred and broken, and that becomes kind of an attraction for each of them,
Mhm.
um, because their brokenness with a normal person m almost kinda makes a relationship impossible.
Mhm.
So in each other, they see this whole that is better than the sum of its part, that the sum is better than its parts, and they can kind of help fix each other, which, of course, for those of you that have real lives, you realize that 2 broken people can't really fix each other. That
Mhm.
doesn't aga my
Yeah.
pastoral side goes, "Yeah, that doesn't work."
Yeah.
But it they try to make it work.
Were the original comics as gritty? So, I mean, again, my exposure to the character is mostly in the TV show. First off, I guess, would you say that the show was it a good representation of the Frank Miller comics? Because the show is quite violent, quite dark, at times. Is that a fair representation of what Miller was doing?
Oh, yeah, yeah, Miller is that's ki part of his brand. I mean, Daredevil is one of the things he's famous for, but it's certainly not the only thing he's famous for.
Yeah.
Um, uh,
300 was him, wasn't it?
yeah, Miller did the 300,
Yeah.
so he's pretty gritty, I mean,
Yeah.
that's one of the things he is known for. So, yes, his comics, got a little bit darker when Miller took over. The early costuming and things of Daredevil, of course, was a little brighter, a little more. That goes back to like the yellow outfit, affectionately the banana outfit, or the mustard and ketchup. Sometimes it's called, but so it was Miller that would introduce a lot more of the themes that became Daredevil. I mean,
Mhm.
stuff that really did become Daredevil. So much so that in, the early '90s, 92, 93, 94, somewhere around there, he redid the origin story and just titled it A Man Without Fear, or The
Mm.
Man Without Fear. And really all it was a retelling of Daredevil's origin. He didn't really change it. I mean, it's just a modernization of the
Mm.
1964 comic, but again, it's a little bit grittier, it's a little bit, um the artwork's certainly more modern, and it would kind of, you know, bring that origin story to kind of a new audience, because now we're 30 years after, the original comic was written in '64. Some of the other major players, and I don't know how deep you want me to go on the comic side, but some of the other major players that would really have roles in kind of shaping the Daredevil universe, would be Kevin Smith. He would take over in the late '90s, as a writer, and probably his most seminal, work would be a art story arc called Guardian Devil. And of course, Kevin Smith is best known as a director. He directed
Mhm.
Clerks and Mallrats and Chasing Amy and Dogma and, a lot of films. And he is, Silent Bob to Jay and Silent Bob. So Kevin Smith, but always been a big comic nerd and fan himself. So he took over as writer in the late '90s and would write the Guardian Devil arc, which would be, the artist on that was Joe Quesada, and again, one of the best, artists in comics, and it would introduce this new, enemy that actually came from the Spider-Man universe and would now kind of bleed over into the Daredevil world, but Spider-Man, of course, is a New York hero as well, so they're I mean, it's not completely implausible that they would fight a similar villain. Obviously, Spider-Man has also fought Kingpin. But, it would introduce Mysterio
Mm.
as a major enemy for Matt and for Daredevil, and it would be in that comic run that Karen Page would actually be killed.
Mm.
So in Guardian Devil, the beloved character of Karen Page dies, and again, and you have to see Matt deal with that, you know, um, and as you've seen in the TV series, Matt does not deal with all these things extremely well, I
No,
mean,
it doesn't.
he's like most human beings. He
Yep.
he 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 bumbles through it. After that arc, you would get Brian Michael Bendis, again, very famous writer, comic
Yep.
book writer. Brian Michael Bendis would take over the Daredevil world after Smith, and he would do a couple runs, one called, I think, Out, which kinda talks about, Daredevil, his secret identity getting out, that the media would get a hold of it and he'd have to answer for some stuff, I mean, for the first time, really. And then a run called The King of Hell's Kitchen, where he takes over almost like Kingpin. He kind of becomes almost he's not a criminal, but he becomes kind of the leader of Hell's Kitchen, and that's in the early 2000s. Of course, you have Shadowland. Shadowland is one of the probably the most beloved comic series where he takes over the Hand, which is the organization
Mhm.
in season 2 that Elektra kind of runs. It's this ninja assassin organization. So in Shadowland, Daredevil would take over the Hand and try to run it better, but then realize that he can't, and have to admit that he cannot change an organization that was bent on being what it was bent on being. I mean, that's the other thing that I've loved about the Daredevil comics as well is because they're so well written, because they're so well inked and arted, um, they would attract top tier talent. That's not always true of all comic characters. I mean, there's if you explore even some of the most beloved comic characters, there are I'll put it in a way that maybe nerds will appreciate. I also grew up loving, Dragon Ball Z. I was a huge Dragon Ball Z fan, and of course, for those of us that know, Dragon Ball Z, when it came here to America or Canada certainly as well, it was old, I mean, it had been on in Japan years,
Mm.
prior to us getting it, but man, I loved Dragon Ball Z. But Dragon Ball Z, one of the big things about Dragon Ball Z that I complained about both then and I still laugh about now is there were, like, these filler episodes, that just sucked. But, like, there'd be these overarching great stories, Cell or what some of the Frieza, some of the other big baddies in that world. And, um and then I vividly remember there was an episode, and I'm not making this up, people can Google it. There's an episode of Dragon Ball Z called Bulma Gets Her License, or Bulma Gets Her Driver's License or something, and literally the whole episode is Bulma, like, getting her driver's license. It's terrible. It's like 23 minutes of awful, and you just kinda go, Did they take was there a strike? I don't know what was happening." But that's not uncommon. I bring that up to say it's not uncommon in comics for something like that to happen, where there's just lulls. But what's awesome about Daredevil is it's almost never had that because
Mm.
he's such a fascinating character. He's so human. And I think that's what makes him so unique because, again, all those characters I mentioned earlier are not. Even someone like Spider-Man who they try to make human,
Yep.
we all know he's not. We all
Yep.
know that he can stop a train with his hands and, I mean, he can do things that I can't do. And I
Yeah.
mean, yes, I don't have sonar either, but, you know, but Matt Murdock always, at the end of the day, seems like a human being. And so I think there's something to the men that write comics and that art, do the art for comics, that when they look at Daredevil, they go, yeah, I want involved. Ed Brubaker would take over, kind of in the mid 2000s and do again a couple of huge storylines. One where he goes to prison and Punisher's in prison and Kingpin is in prison. Again, that gets touched on
Yeah.
in the show, right?
Yep. It
So
does.
a lot of these main arcs of storylines that I've talked about, are some of the biggest in the comics, and Netflix kind of picked and pulled from a number of them to kind of, do a patchwork, this kind of Frankenstein of 3 seasons of some of the most famous, um comic series in Daredevil's world.
You mentioned just how human Matt is, and because like, as I was watching through the show, uh, it made me think that, is there a tougher superhero in that he is just in there, like, with his fists and just getting pummeled and just punching, and he gets up. I mean, so going into what I think is maybe one of the most brilliant scenes of a show or a movie I've ever seen is at the end of episode 1 of season 1, the
A
hallway fight
hallway
scene.
fight, yeah.
That is one of the most incredible action moments I have ever seen, and he's just fighting all these guys in the hall, going into one room, going into another room, and he's exhausted.
Yep.
Absolute like, they had to have I don't know if you probably know this, but for those who don't, they had to have, like, 6 different actors do that scene, and so when we went into the one room and came out, it was another guy, and, like, so on to make that scene even possible because that is such a hard thing for a human to actually fight that many guys for that long, and but I love how he is just getting hammered. When he falls, it hurts, and he's all bloody, and there's no pretending that he's got super strength. I mean, we just watched, a group of us went to go see the new, Captain America movie, and you
Mhm.
see that they try to say he's human, he didn't take the serum, but yet he can stop Red Hulk from swinging a lamppost at him with his bare hands. It's like, okay, but, like, this in Daredevil, they actually lean into that, and it's like he is a human. He gets stabbed, it hurts. Like, he gets and I love that about the character is that he is just he yes, he does have super hearing and his senses are enhanced, so I'm not saying it's not somewhat fanciful in its world, but that's, like, I think even one of the things I really did like about the show and just the Daredevil universe. So you were mentioning how Mysterio kinda pops in a little bit in one of those comic runs, and I would actually be really interested to go and read that because all of the villains thus far in the movie or sorry, in the show, it's there's a real sense of plausibility to it, where
Yeah.
Kingpin, yes, he has some crazy strength, but he's also maybe just, like, a super strong guy. He's not altering reality. He's not trying to bring an alien race from space or from like through another dimension. It's just he is just a menacing man who is terrifying and crazy strong and brilliant. You have these ninjas who are just I mean that's yeah, cool. There's probably ninjas out there doing maybe not to this degree, but it's like believable. And I think
Yeah.
that's for me why I found and I actually really want to go and read some of those comic issues that you were talking about because I found I was just uncomfortable watching it because it felt way more believable. Nobody believes some purple dude like Thanos is real and could ever do that kind of thing, but this guy who is incredibly jaded from his past, who becomes this mob boss in New York, that's entirely like, that's real. Maybe not to his degree, but that's what I find so fascinating about watching it and just, like, the character in the world is, like, this actually feels kinda like real life.
Yeah, it's and again, when you go there's a reason I brought up some of the stuff that was going on here in America in the early '60s because I don't think you have a Daredevil without that coloring the world of Stan Lee and, Jack Kirby and Bill Everett. I don't see this gritty character not and who happens to be Irish Catholic, coming out of a world that isn't the early, '60s of America, so again, when you look at a Jimmy Hoffa style, Teamsters, I mean, that's what Kingpin is. I mean, and just like in real life, they've convinced themselves that they're doing good. The Teamsters unions and things, and again, anyone that's watching this that's in a union, I'm not saying you're all corrupt and evil and stuff, though I think you have problems. Um, but uh, the unions all started for great reasons. That employees really were being, you know, worked to death. I mean, there were no labor laws back in those days, and so the unions and things did form out of altruistic reasons, ideally, and then like so many human institutions, because of sin, they become corrupt. They get this amazing sense of power because you get this corporate buy-in from the employees at a steel factory or 10 steel factories, and now you really are wielding a huge amount of power and now political lobbying power, and I mean, it's there's a lot of money exchanging hands, and you get a guy like a Jimmy Hoffa or in this world, the Kingpin, who has told himself, I love my people.
Uh-huh,
I love this city. I'm
uh-huh.
only doing what's best for us. And even if there's an element of truth to it, because sadly, I think there can be, it's but at what cost? What are you willing to do for the betterment of, Hell's Kitchen or for and that's true not only for Kingpin, that ends up through the life of Daredevil that becomes true for him. What is Matt willing to do to save Hell's Kitchen that might force him to cross a line that he's uncomfortable with?
Well, you mentioned just how the time that you're living in and how, that definitely led to the character and the world, but I found even just the tension in watching the show and seeing the corruption that was I mean, Kingpin spoilers to those who haven't watched the show, I'm sure we're gonna get into some kind of spoilery thing, but he ends up controlling the FBI, which is
Yeah.
crazy, right? The highest one of the highest law enforcement agencies in the world, and most powerful, and yet this guy controls it, and you see how he controls it, and then when for those of us who perhaps were seeing things as they really were during the COVID times, you then start it just kinda it actually made me feel, like, inflame that a little bit in me where I'm seeing that, and you see this guy getting away with it, and how long it felt for us when we were seeing these people just get away with it. These I mean, in Canada, Justin Trudeau is as corrupt a politician as you get, and yet he just keeps getting away with it, and so then as I was, watching this, and it's just because that question of what is Matt or Daredevil, is there basis for him doing the things he's doing in a corrupt world where the system's not doing anything to actually punish these people? Now, you and I think would agree that, the state is the means by which God in a properly ordered society is, executing justice and protecting people and, the sword belongs to the state, but obviously within God's parameters. But then, like, well, what do you do in a world that is lost and corrupt and you do have these evil things? Because it's uncomfortable to think about. I mean, you got the Punisher, who I thought, what's his name? Barenthal. What's the
Yeah,
actor's name?
John Bernthal.
John
Yeah.
Barenthal. I thought he was awesome as the Punisher. But as like a dad who has 4 kids, 3 girls, and you know what he went through and what's
Yeah.
happening and all these things, and I'm just there's that tension as I'm sitting there watching it of, yep, vengeance belongs to the Lord, but then it's just, but what if, right? Because that's that, and it's again, it's the flesh and the spirit battling within me where I'm watching that. So, well, what would I do if somebody had like hurt my family the way that they hurt his family? And now I hope I have enough people around me that would prevent me from becoming the Punisher, and that I wouldn't go that route. But I can. I think it's just interesting in the show how it brings that up, and it's not as clear cut, or at least they're trying to make it because he's not being portrayed as the bad guy, the Punisher. The people love him because the police aren't doing anything, and so that's one of the things I do find interesting with the show is it's like it kind of there's some tension there in what is the right thing to do because justice is good and we ought to want to see justice prevail. But what does that look like in a system that is utterly corrupt and bankrupt and isn't going to do that? And that's what I find just throughout the entire show, and I'm sure the comics as well, is just a fascinating dilemma as you're engaging with it.
Well, one of the things that I mentioned my son earlier. My son's name's Micah, and he's named Micah because my favorite verse is Micah 6:8. And Micah 6:8, for those of you watching that don't, perhaps know scripture, or have it committed to memory, is not that I have all of it committed to memory either, I just happen to have this verse committed to memory, is, "He has told you what is good, O man, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God." And I try to teach we repeat that verse every night when my son goes to bed, and I'm trying now as he's, getting a little older, to start just simply unpacking it at his, age appropriate, levels. But one of the things that I would say, for adults that are watching or, older teenagers that might watch the show is, well, let's unpack some of that. Do justly. Well, God is a God of justice, and he expects us as his people to live justly. So we are expected by God to be men and women of justice. And again, because the world is set up in a more patriarchal form, whether you like it or not, that primarily does fall to us as men. So men are expected to be just and to administer justice. Now, I love that immediately in that verse, Christ follows it up with, and love mercy. And why? Because God loves mercy. He extends mercy all the
Mhm.
time. And so what the complexity of that verse is because on the surface it looks very, da 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 da, very simple. But as I've started to unpack that verse over the years much more and then went, to Bible college and seminary and started to learn how to hermeneutic and exegete scripture better, I started to go, wow, there's a lot being said there. Yes, it does look simple on the surface, but we should love mercy and give mercy at every opportunity we possibly can. But with the understanding, because certainly God understands this better than any human could, mercy sadly sometimes runs its course. And there are times when mercy isn't on the table any longer. And when you love mercy, but mercy has proven to be, I hate to use the word ineffective, but for whatever reason, the person is unrepentant. Then what do? You default back to option A. You know, God still says, "Well, don't forget option A." I wanted you to love mercy, and my son, you have. You've tried to be as merciful as you could be in this circumstance, but I still demand that you act justly.
Mhm.
So that's it is such an incredible verse to go, wow, if men would act like this, and yes, certainly the state wields the sword, but even if fathers would act like this with their own children,
Yeah.
we wouldn't have some of the insanity that you see going on with kids that, run the show at home and they, pulling knives and guns on each other at school, and all the insanity that we see in the world from, 14-year-old kids. And I think those fathers, if there's even a father in the house, they have forgotten what God's expectations are, which is I expect you to run an orderly universe.
Mhm.
You are my representatives on earth. That's what the dominion mandate all the way back in the garden is. You know, I gave you this perfect garden. Now go replicate it. It's what Christ is talking about in Matthew 28 when he gives the Great Commission. The Great Commission is nothing more than kind of a New Testament twist on the dominion mandate. If the dominion mandate is, go into all the world and subdue it and be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth, then the Great Commission takes that and spiritualizes it and say, go into all the world and preach the gospel and disciple the nations.
Mhm.
It's a very it's kind of this New Testament reiteration of the dominion mandate. And so yeah, when we look at these characters, the thing that's so appealing to us, whether we know it or not, because even non-Christians can be, of course, appealed to this because they're created in the image of God. So a non-believer can even watch something like this and go, "Daggone it, that's right. I want the bad guys to get their comeuppance." I want the good guy to win. I
Yep.
want the bad guy to be defeated. There's something in us that just yearns for justice, where we say, "But that's not right." It's not okay that the kingpin just gets off because he's bigger and stronger and more powerful. That shouldn't matter. That's why again, the nuance of a blind lawyer is not shouldn't be lost on anybody watching either the show or reading the comics. What is Lady Justice herself? She's
Mhm.
blind.
Yep.
So why is Matt Murdock a perfect guy to administer justice? Because he's blind, because he
Yep.
doesn't care. He doesn't know if it's a white person, a black person, a brown person. He doesn't know anything about the person other than, "I know the crime you've committed, and that's all I'm concerned about."
It's interesting how when you think of the dominion mandate and, like you were mentioning, the patriarchal nature of creation, and just that we're called to rule, but we're called to rule well. We're called to rule, with a love for God and love for neighbor. And is Wilson Fisk not the exact opposite of what it means to be a man who rules well, who rules with a fear of God and love for neighbor? Because it's the exact thing that happens when a man even just like takes those natural inclinations to rule, but when you're entirely inward focused, this is the man that is produced is Wilson Fisk. And funny enough, a man who's produced because his father was such a terrible father, and he a bit like for all intents and purposes, I don't know if the show was it was a comic accurate in terms of how his father died, but spoilers, Wilson Fisk kills his father because his father was beating his mom and was just a terrible guy, which then has so much, I mean, plays out throughout the entire the TV show. Um, explaining more about why he is what he is, and I wanna talk about Daredevil or sorry, about Wilson Fisk for a bit because I think he is an absolutely astonishing and fascinating character because he is one of the most terrifying men I've ever seen on film because his level-headedness in all of this, like, it doesn't he's crazy, but it also is almost like he's not crazy. Like, he's not a Joker who's obviously lost his mind and he's just running around giggling about all this stuff. Like, Wilson Fisk is calm, he's collected, and, like, that almost makes him more terrifying in the fact that this is, like, he's choosing this. Like, this is just, like, a choice he is making to be the man, that he is. But then there's just these, like, little parts, and I think, what's his name? Dionoro? What's his first name?
Vincent D'Onofrio.
D'Onofrio, that's it.
Yeah,
Um, there's, like, times there where there's actual, like, sympathy for like, he actually brings out these moments where you feel bad for him,
yeah.
but then he goes and, like, bashes the guy's head in, but it's just, well, for a second there, I was actually kinda feeling for you. So it's just there are layers to this guy, and he is, like, he's not powerful because he can again, alter reality or persuade people's like, change people's thinking or read their minds or anything like that. He is just a menacing human being. I think he is I'd be curious, like, where would you put him in the pantheon of villains in the Marvel universe? I think he's right up there for me, but what about you?
No, I would agree. I think and we both said that we're both DC fans, and again, you've had Keith on the show, and you talked about Superman. So let me bring up, the probably the most well-known villain in the Superman world. To me, Kingpin is the intelligence and the cunning of a Lex Luthor, but with a lot of the physical attributes that Lex doesn't possess.
Hmm.
So what makes Lex scary is he's always a step ahead of you, he's smarter than you, he's more capable than you, he's wealthier than you. Well, Wilson Fisk is all of those things, so he is very Lex Luthor-esque in the way that he approaches the world. He's again, like you said, in that one season, he controls the FBI. I mean, that you you're a pretty, capable and powerful man if you can pull something like that off.
Mhm.
But then you add to that his physical menacing size. He's just he is and if anything, as amazing and don't get me wrong, I think maybe Vincent D'Onofrio was made for this role almost to a degree that I've almost never seen another actor made for a role. I mean, this is one of the greatest casting jobs in the history of Hollywood
Yep.
is Vincent D'Onofrio as the Kingpin. Um, but as big as Vincent D'Onofrio got for some of these, seasons and all of that, and as menacing as he could look on film, the reason that they used the actor in the film in the 2000 and what I think it was 2003 film with Ben Affleck, which was horrible, but they used a different actor, and I can't remember that actor's name, but he played in his most famous role was in The Green Mile. And so he played the really, big prisoner in The Green Mile, and,
Oh, yeah, Michael Clark Duncan.
yep, I knew he was a 3-namer, and I couldn't
Yep.
remember him. And so Michael Clark Duncan plays the Kingpin in that movie, just because they tried to get somebody that was even close to the physical size
Yep.
of what the Kingpin is in the comics. Because in the comics, he is almost and I say this somewhat tongue in cheek, comically large. I mean, he's massive. He's just he fills up the cell or the frame, it's he's just a beast of a guy. Now,
Would
you're
the
right, he doesn't
would
have superpowers, but just his girth, his size is enough to just be overwhelming.
would the Into the Spider-Verse Kingpin be like a
Yes,
cat that would that be the how
yes.
one would expect in the comics? Yeah.
That's the Kingpin of the comics where it's
Yep.
almost you're almost like, "Well, that's ridiculous." So yeah, it is really I mean, he is so he's Lex Luthor brilliant, Lex Luthor wealthy, Lex Luthor cunning, um, but with a physical dominance that Lex Luthor could only dream of, right? So that you're right, that's what makes him so terrifying. Now, could he take on the Hulk? No. I mean, that's why the street level heroes are not the galactic level heroes. I mean, that's why Marvel kinda has them categorized differently. But again, he is capable enough that he has been a somewhat formidable foe for even Spider-Man, who is superpowered. I mean, so Now that gets into how Spider-Man actually is always pulling his punches, and he's never actually doing things to his peak because he knows he'd kill people, but
Mm.
this is not an episode on
Yeah.
Spider-Man, so I will not devolve into knowledge
We
of Spider-Man.
we can do that another day,
But
as
yeah.
well. Yeah. Well, oh, what was I wanting to there was something that you had just said there that I was wanting to oh, yeah, so because of Kingpin and his, like, his physical presence and he, like, had in the show, he pretty brutally kills some guys.
Oh, yeah.
Um, as I was watching it, I was like, "Okay, there's obviously liberty in the Christian life for certain activities. Some people it's okay, some people it's not." And as I was watching, I was like, "Okay, so there are certain Christians who would not be comfortable watching this show because of some of the violence
Sure.
that's in it." And so I'd just be curious for you, just as like as a pastor, like for as I watch it, I think, well, violence in and of itself isn't a bad thing, right? There are very violent scenes depicted that, interestingly, a lot of Christians don't like to tell their kids that David cut the head off of Goliath, but it's like you kind of have to. So I don't think you can make an argument just because, oh, it's violent, it is in and of itself bad. But I'd be curious for you as like a big fan of Daredevil, as a big fan of the show, would you do you think an easy argument can be made for why it would be permissible and actually maybe perhaps a good thing to be able to watch something of violence like this as a Christian? Or is this a thing that obviously there's gonna be different levels of comfort in violence, but what would you say to that person who's like, "Hey, it depicts violence." What would you as a pastor say to them?
I think, man, that's a great question, and that gets into a very broad topic, that historically the church has just called conscience,
Yeah.
and so the Christian conscience, is oddly enough, it's been kind of a lost and now refound thing in the last 5 or 6 years. Really, COVID helped kind of refind it, of this idea of Christian conscience. Can we force something upon people or what have you? Um, so I would say it's a matter of conscience. Now, this is one thing I would say, whether it's as a pastor or a father or a husband, and the answer to that would be yes, it's as all of those things. You cannot unsee things that you have seen, and you don't have to unsee things that you've never seen. So my wife, um, you know, has there have been times that I'll just turn something on and I'll use a real world example. We used to watch The Walking Dead. That's another comic series that I read years ago when it was new, because again, a lot of people never knew what The Walking Dead was till it came to TV. Well, The Walking Dead, by the time it came to TV, had been out for a long, long time in the comics. And many of us had read the comics years before there was a TV show. And well, in the comics and then in the show, and I could not believe they did it in the show because it is so brutal, and the comics are written in black and white because they are so bloody that Robert Kirkman didn't wanna have to deal with the censors and all of the other stuff, so he said, "These are so grotesque, they're so bloody, I'm just gonna keep them in black and white so that I don't have to fight the censors." Um, so when it came to TV, my wife was fine watching extreme violence against zombies because,
Mm,
again, there was a disconnect.
yep,
She knew zombies aren't real. It wasn't, it was not real. Well, then you get to whatever season of the show it is, and it's I can't remember what season 3, 4, whatever it is, but in the comics, it's when they start to really realize there's other survivors, and the first big group of other survivors that they come across will be led by a man named, Negan or Negan, however people pronounce it.
yep,
And, and he becomes the next big baddie. And he's the first human baddie. I mean, up till now, it's been these hordes and hordes of zombies, and as long as you steer clear of them, you're pretty safe. Well, he's the first human that they have to go up against, and there's a scene, again, spoiler alerts for the show or the comic. There's a scene where he beats Glenn to death with a ball bat. And I mean, even in the comics, even in black and white, it's one of the most violent, visceral scenes I've ever seen in a comic book ever. It is grotesque violence. And I thought, there's no way they're gonna do that on the show. It's just way too violent. So then when they did, I
yeah.
was like, "Holy smokes, I can't believe they put it to film." You
Yeah.
know, so and I bring that scene up because that scene broke my wife.
Mm.
You know, she, like, cried. I mean, like,
Yeah.
it she had nightmares, you know, and ever since then, I realized even for adults, there are things you can't unsee. There are things that you shouldn't probably subject yourselves to. I can't answer that for you as far as what your limitation is. I don't do horror movies for that reason. Um, I just there are certain that's a genre, a subgenre that I just don't do. I think, you know, Saw and some of these that are just horror for horror's sake, just grotesque, gore and violence, just, you know, oh, the ones where they've passed a law where you can just go kill anybody you want at night, you know,
Oh, yeah.
you know, those
Yep.
I just those are not something that I subject myself to. Um but let's be also honest that the world's not a nice place. The world sadly is full of sin and it is full of violence and you could turn on the news, you know, and see grotesque examples of violence. Um, so I do think you need to protect your kids, you need to protect your spouses, you need to protect your own eyes. But again, that is a matter of Christian conscience, and you're gonna have to kind of walk that delicately with your, you know, within your four walls of your house.
Yeah, I think because one of the things that, we wanna do with Reforming Nerdom is also help people think just, biblically about life, but about media and all those things, and I think to your point where you said, like, the world is just not clean, and yet I think a lot of Christians, we kinda live in this world that we've really cleaned up. I mean, a big part of that, thankfully, we live in an age where we're living in at least the vestiges of the expansion of the kingdom, and we had for many years in the West God's law, and so, like, we haven't had wars the way that people have had in other parts of the world, and, for a while anyways, wrong people were, like, people who did bad things were punished and executed where appropriate, and that's not really a thing anymore, but because I think the church became pretty, uh I don't wanna say, like, weak, but weak in some ways, and then it's just interesting how people just have these, like, broad brush things of, "Oh, you can't watch a violent scene." It's like, okay, well, is watching it in a war movie appropriate? Because, I mean, war is depicting things that really did happen, and there's I think, again, age appropriateness, but there's a point where that becomes incredibly helpful for people to realize just how terrible war is, and it's better to watch it in a movie than it is to watch um, real people actually being blown up,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
that I would prefer my kids to see a film and not watching it in real life. So I think it's just it is not as easy as just, oh, there's violence, don't watch it. But I think in as I was watching this show, because there are absolutely elements of this show that I don't like, and I wish they would just not be in there at all. Right? There's a couple scenes of intimacy. Thankfully, there's no nudity. It's pretty obvious. You can just skip ahead. Like they at least give you a runway, at least in the 3 seasons of that show, so that you don't have to watch those things. So you can skip ahead. They make it pretty obvious that, hey, this thing is gonna happen. And it's not as bad as other shows, but again, I still don't wanna watch that. So do I wanna see that? No, but do I am I gonna write off the entire thing because an element of it is bad? Well, I don't think that's the appropriate thing to do either, because there are good redeemable things about this show, like all these themes that we were talking about, the characters that are excellent. So I just think it's not as black and white as people want to make it out to be, and because I think the challenge that we're like you and I are facing right now as people who enjoy this stuff is we're just first off trying to make it uh people realize that it's permissible to watch Spider-Man, let alone permissible to watch a show that is violent, that does depict more mature themes. So I think we're a ways away from, but again, I think that conscience is a really important thing where, yeah, if your conscience doesn't allow you to watch it, it is sin for you to watch it,
Yeah.
so don't watch it. But because there's nothing telling me in scripture, now it says not to do evil things, it tells me not to celebrate evil things, but seeing depictions of things is very different. Because even I was just talking to somebody recently and, thinking about the day myself being somebody who sees in history the expansion of the kingdom, and we're gonna see this world eventually be very Christianized. I like that is my belief that we're gonna see a world that is largely won over to the gospel, and,
Hashtag
um
postmillennialism.
well, that's and so I would have a very optimistic outlook
Yeah.
for that. But, okay, so now we're living in this time, let's say it is 9,500 years from now when art and movies are still a thing. Well, you're probably not gonna have a movie that doesn't depict somebody doing something evil, because for you to have a movie that's even celebrating a good character, well, it's kind of a boring movie and a boring story if it's just a bunch of good people doing good things all the time and there's no tension, there's no conflict, there's no victory over anything. Well, you're necessarily going to have bad people doing bad things being depicted in that movie, even in the midst of a culture that is gonna be, you know, based on God's law and love for neighbor and all those things that we, hope to see and will see one day. But that's where, well, you're gonna have that, right? Even in a largely Christian nation, you're still gonna have film because you wanna celebrate the good things of being in the kingdom, but that has to be in contrast to the bad things.
Yes. I mean, so I do think that now, would I ever say, that there's verse in scripture that says to the pure, all things are pure, and would I say if there's someone, that is just, pure as the driven snow and they have just made a covenant with their eyes that they're not going to watch, this kind of, then, hey, by all means,
Yeah.
I would never, you know, pressure someone into, "Oh, come on," I mean, no, that I'm not a middle school kid, so I mean, I'm I'm not gonna descend into tactics like that anyway. But, but no, I don't think it is of such value that you're, like, missing out if you don't watch it, because again, the Bible is not an antiseptic book either, and it's one of the things that I think personally is one of my favorite things about scripture, and secondarily, I think it's one of the greatest proofs that scripture is what it claims to be. Because if man had written a book telling the story of man and God, man would be the hero, and all of the foibles and flaws of the main characters that were human would be covered up. I mean, there'd be no David was, taking another man's wife and then having him killed. I mean, those things wouldn't be in there. The fact that God doesn't hide the warts, that he doesn't hide all of the sin nature of man as he tells his redemptive story, to me is one of the greatest proofs that the Bible is true.
Yeah. Well, what is the I can't remember, you may remember this. Who's the prophet who, like, cut up the girl into all the, like, the little pieces
Oh,
and
yeah, I can't remember his name, but yeah, it's in and
but
it's
Like,
yeah,
what a twisted, morbid,
yeah.
disgusting thing, and yet God doesn't shy away from it to say, like, "This happened," or, our when we were at our, or sorry, like, at our church, we were preaching through a couple years ago, and, I was sharing the pulpit a little bit with Nate, and we were teaching through the Olivet Discourse. Mark 13 is where we were. I had the joy of going through the Great Tribulation and explaining to people how that was a past thing. And what was really interesting is that you see that that's actually where it says like this, this terrible thing will come upon this generation as it will never be, it hasn't been and will never be again. And when you actually go back, I forget the verse, but it's a Deuteronomy where God talks about unfaithful Israel. And one of the signs of the coming judgment upon them would be that they would start eating their own children.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, okay, so here we are now going through this text, and Josephus tells us historically that that actually happened. So here you have, like, there's things in the Bible that most Christians would say, oh, we can't tell our kids that. It's like, or no, we actually do have to tell our kids that. Now, how I say that to my 8-year-old is probably gonna be different than your kids who are probably a bit older, or to my 3-year-old. I'm probably not gonna go into detail, but I'm not gonna not tell them
That's right.
because it's uncomfortable. It's how many Christians, I mean, there's not too many coloring sheets with that, for Sunday school in most churches, as there probably shouldn't be, but most Christians would be uncomfortable even with the reality of that, and that's where I think we need to, again, whatever your conscience allows, but we can't just say that depictions of violence or evil are in and of themselves bad. God uses them explicitly, and that's where, but how are we engaging with it, and how are we, like, what do we think about that? I think that's, like, the most important thing versus, "Oh, it's just bad." And that's where, yeah, I think some people can probably get into, some issues with that. But before I'm just looking at the time here, Corey, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time today, but I'm just curious. We've been talking about the show. You had said in one of your first messages to us that you thought Daredevil season one, maybe the whole series, but at the time I think you had mentioned season one was the better than Endgame.
Oh, yeah.
So you would still
Oh,
affirm
yeah.
that Daredevil is a better product than Endgame.
I think Daredevil, the whole series, now I don't what I'm still very curious to see what they do with season 4. I hope they're faithful to it. The preview, which we can watch if you'd like, certainly seems to show that they're gonna try to be faithful to what Netflix did. Um, but, not counting the new season, which no one's seen yet, I think the first 3 seasons of Daredevil are the greatest product, most faithful to the comics, most accurate to the characters. I think it's the greatest work product that Marvel has put out, period.
I mean, I I have a hard time because they're so different in terms of Endgame versus this. Like they're so different in like you have so many different types of characters in the movies. You had a like the Endgame moment was just a, or I guess yeah, the Endgame moment when the portals were opening up, but
On
then
your
also
left. Yeah,
right
on your
like
left. I mean,
there
yeah.
were things that they did there that were just
Yeah.
it took them 15 years of world building and story character arcs to be able to get to that. And so I think in some aspects, Endgame stands alone in cinema as this thing, a moment in cinema and film that I just don't think is ever gonna be replicated. The way that they broke it into 2, but if I was just looking at a like the actual overall quality of the product, the action sequences, the cinematography, the characters, like I think I'm hard pressed to disagree with you as just like an artistic product. I think Daredevil is the best thing that they've ever done. I have a hard time disagreeing with that as I because I've been thinking about that a lot since you even mentioned it. It's something that Nate, Ben, and I often are talking about. And in watching the show again, catching up, I kind of binged through it in preparation for this, and it's spectacular. It really is a spectacular product. Now, do you think they're gonna be able to reclaim that magic in Born Again?
If they don't Disneyfy it and they let the characters, because that's the beautiful thing about bringing the characters back is they didn't mess with that, which I say to their credit. If they let Charlie Cox and Vincent D'Onofrio and, the other characters just do what they do, and try to recapture, Eldon Henson, I think, plays Foggy Nelson,
Yep.
Deborah Ann Woll, is Karen Page. Um, so, yeah, if they let those 4 main characters shine and then sure, introduce new characters, that's fine, I don't think anyone minds that. I think Frank Castle comes back in this season as well,
He
so
does.
again, and Barenthal is a genius in that role.
Yep.
Again, he'd be right there on the same level almost with, D'Onofrio. I mean, created for this role.
Yep.
So if those actors do good work and they don't ruin the script and they don't make, Daredevil do the walk of shame with,
Oh my.
She-Hulk like he did
Yeah.
in the She-Hulk series. And, I mean, if they don't do some of the stupid stuff they do, then yes, I think they can. I mean, because I saw a glimpse of it even in the Spider-Man movie, where Matt shows up as Matt, you know, and just for 10 seconds, you see Matt being Matt the lawyer, and then in a nanosecond, he becomes Daredevil to catch that brick, and I'm like, "Yeah, you got it right. That's holy crap." So if so they've proven, kind of proof of concept. They've proven that they do understand the character and they can pull it off. It's just, will Disney get out of its own way?
Yeah, I'm curious how the groundedness of the TV show will work as part of the MCU because even I didn't watch She-Hulk. Did you watch She-Hulk?
Unfortunately.
Okay, you did. I didn't even watch it. So then I was just watching a recap video, kind of in preparation for the new show. Hey, just watch these things, and it was mentioning him, and just seeing him in that kind of more of a goofy thing, it just didn't feel right in his involvement in She-Hulk. I know Kingpin or Fisk was in the
Echo series,
he was in Echo,
and
and
he
then
was
before
also
that,
in Hawkeye.
Hawkeye,
Yeah,
and yeah, and it just didn't feel quite right,
yeah.
and so I hope they don't compromise the like, how grounded it was, and so one of the things in one of the featurettes that I was watching just, yesterday that gives me hope is that they were really emphasizing how the new show is being filmed in New York, and it's not no green screens. When you see New York in the background, that is real New York, and so I think they're trying to keep that like, they're the boots on the ground, like, this is happening in New York City, and so I'm hoping they do that because
Yeah.
it'd be really weird if Thanos popped up. If it's just that's just it doesn't feel right in this, and I know it's gonna in some way eventually, like, they're gonna tie in, and he'll be in a I don't know if they'll do a, what are they, the Defenders ever
Yep,
again, and
yep.
that'll be a big Marvel thing, I'm not sure, but I hope
Which,
they can do it.
again, I liked the Defenders. I know it was not as good as his solo standalone stuff, but, but I thought the Defenders got I think the Defenders will age better than people think. I think at the time, the standalone show was so good that the Defenders seemed less than, but now that we've seen some of the Disney Marvel stuff and how hokey they've taken it, I think if people go back now and watch Defenders, they're gonna go, "Actually, that wasn't near as bad as I thought it was."
Yeah, well, and I wish I had known that the watching order for the show because I started season 3, and season 3 starts with Matt getting blown off a building, and
Yeah.
I'm just like, "Oh, okay, this is a thing that they're gonna explain to me what happened," and they never really did until way later in the show, and they mentioned something, and then I was like, "Wait, this is sounding like I should already know this," and it turns out it was the end of the Defenders that
Yep.
was then led into I had no idea because I never I think I started watching Luke Cage maybe, never really didn't watch Jessica Jones, didn't watch the so I missed out on this whole TV universe, and then all of a sudden it was starting. So if I guess for our listeners, if you're interested in it, just know that there is some required reading to be able to catch up entirely. And then even in the show, I'm very curious how I mean, if you've seen the trailer and listeners, if you've watched the trailer for the show, he's the potentially going to be mayor. And all of a sudden it's like, wait, what? And because after you watch the end of season 3, that's it. Wilson Fisk is doing very different things and going somewhere else than being mayor of New York. But then it turns out that there was, yeah, his cameo in the Hawkeye show, and then he appeared again in Echo, and then I think Echo was the last that we saw of Fisk. Um, so now I'm watching Echo because again, I went through a huge period where I just didn't watch anything Marvel because I was so jaded. So now it's like, okay, I want to go back. So in preparation for Tuesday when the show comes out, I'm gonna have I think it's 5 episodes of Echo, so it's not a huge investment, but I'm just curious
It
how
is
they're gonna
because they're terrible, but
well, and that's kind of what I heard, and I don't really care, but now that I wanna know what's going on, it's like, fine, I'll stomach watching this probably not great show from what I hear, but there's a couple things there where it's like, I'm curious how they explain that because Fisk I mean, again, spoilers, everybody, Fisk goes to jail again at the end of season 3, and then he just pops up in Hawkeye, and nobody really explained how he got out of jail and what happened, and I looked into it, and they're just like, "Yeah, that's kind of a hole that they've just never really explained," so I'm wondering if they will, and how does this former crime boss become the mayor of New York? That seems like quite the redemption arc that they have to explain, so things like that, I'm genuinely curious now to see how they handle it.
yeah, it's again, they're splicing, as I said earlier, they're splicing some of the comics together. The if anyone is interested in the comic world, the season 2 arc where Punisher and Matt kind of face off and have this complex relationship, that's, from a series called Means and Ends, um, which is which is a fantastic series. So if anyone's interested in that, that's just, that's yeah, Punisher and Daredevil Means and Ends.
Okay. Well, I'm definitely gonna be looking to buy, or if maybe my library has them, or if I can just get a digital subscription to Marvel or something and read the, digital comics, but this has made me wanna go and read the comics because I have again, I watched the shows when they were coming out when they first came out, the first 2 seasons anyways, but now I just have a way new heightened appreciation for the character, and so now I do wanna go back to the source material, so I'm gonna spend a little bit of time doing that. Well, Corey, is there anything else that you wanna add to this or, anything else in preparation? I guess, do you have high hopes? What if you had to guess right now, would you anticipate the first 2 episodes that drop on Tuesday? Will you give them a thumbs up or a thumbs down? What's your guess?
I think I'll thumbs up them.
Yeah.
I think I'm expecting at the end of this season 7 out of 10. You know, I mean, I think I think people do learn from their mistakes by and large, and I think Marvel and Disney have lost enough capital, both financial capital and human capital, that they're starting to wake up and go, "We need to just make good stuff again. We used to be the biggest deal in movies, and now people hate us, and so we just need to figure out how to make good product again."
And this is one of those products that was a success, and
Yeah.
it was a critical success, it was a fan success, so just literally do this again, just
Yep.
continue doing it, and you will start to reclaim some of those jaded fans like myself. If you just make it good, make it what people wanted, and don't insert any nonsense, you're gonna have a hit. And just and, like, we watched through Skeleton Crew. Disney made a good TV show.
Mhm.
Skeleton Crew was really good. Just nobody watched it because people are kind of fed up with them. So it's just, well, you guys are gonna it's gonna take a bit, right? You're gonna have to create more than just one good show. They need to have a couple in a row to prove that, okay, course is the course has been corrected. We're now just focusing on good stories again. And I really do think this is going to be good. I would say, yeah, I'd be in that expectation of a 7 to 8 range as well. Like I have high hopes for this. Just because again, they brought everybody back. And I just think anything with these characters is like you really have to screw it up to make these characters not shine and be compelling. Like the writing's gonna have to just be abysmal, and I just don't see them doing that.
No, I think they have learned, and I guess in just a few short days, we will see. So,
Yeah.
and
Well,
thank you for having me on. This was a blast. I really appreciate it.
I am very happy we were able to make this work. And before we wrap up though, why don't you just remind everybody where they can find you, Corey?
Sure. Again, my name's Cory Wing. I'm the host of a show called CivEccly Minded. It is spelled weird, so if you can read my shirt, if you can't, if it's CIVECC for ecclesiology, so civics, ecclesiology, and family is where my name comes from. So CivEcclyMinded.com is my website. You can go to YouTube and look up CivEccly Minded. I'm on Instagram, X, Facebook, all the stuff. I have a Spotify and Apple. Um, on YouTube is an expanded universe of sermons and political engagement, and all that stuff is on YouTube. Um, but that can span anywhere from a minute short to, again, interviews like this that are an hour plus. My audio podcast is strictly interview segments like these that we did today. So those are longer format stuff on my audio podcast. But yeah, so that's where I can be found. I am also the pastoral intern at Sheer Presbyterian Church in Mooresville, North Carolina. So if you're in the greater Charlotte area or certainly on the north side of Charlotte, come see us. We would love to break bread with you and worship the Lord with you.
Very cool. Well, listeners, we'll have all those links in the show notes as well. So you can find Corey's YouTube, Instagram. You can follow him. Brother, it was great to be able to have you on here. And listeners, just a reminder that you can check out all of our videos on YouTube. You can find us on podcast services around the world. And you can also join us over on Patreon, where you'll get access to our Discord community, which is becoming a lot of fun. So join us over there. But until then, stay nerdy.